Thank you very much, Hannah, and hello to everybody online and everybody in the room. My name is Alex McAuliffe, and I'm a visiting researcher at the program on negotiation at the Harvard Law School, as well as a PhD candidate at Tufts University at the Fletcher School. And I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker today, Miriam Anderson. Dr. Anderson is an associate professor of international relations at the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Toronto Metropolitan University. She's also a visiting fellow at the Center for Women, Peace and Security at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Anderson recently co-edited a special issue for the journal International Negotiation entitled Women and Peace Negotiations. And she's also the author of Windows of Opportunity, How Women Seize Peace Negotiations for Political Change, a wonderful book if you haven't read it. She's currently working on projects related to women's peace activism during setbacks, including after the collapse of peace processes and women's politics in exile. So given her vast experience and thinking on these topics, we are very excited to have her with us today to kick off a semester-long exploration into these topics. Her talk today is entitled Getting to the Table and Getting Results, How Women Leverage Peace Negotiations. And so Dr. Anderson will speak for about 50 minutes, and then we will have 25 minutes for questions from our audience. We ask that you hold your questions until the end. And for those of you on Zoom, you can just raise your hand. And because this is a meeting style, we can make it a little bit more interactive and you'll be able to ask your questions. And of course, for those in the room, we welcome questions from you as well. We do ask that audience questions be brief, on topic, and most importantly, posed in the form of a question and related to the presenter's research. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Miriam. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction, and thank you very much for this opportunity to kick off this seminar series. I'm very excited about attending the rest of the seminars throughout the series as well. The speakers and the topics look really interesting and really important. Also, I want to say a special thank you. I was at the airport yesterday on my way to fly to Boston, and my flight was canceled. And Laura Botero spent over an hour on the phone calling travel agents and trying to get me another flight, and it didn't work out. But I'm so glad that everyone was able to, the organizing team was able to juggle things and make it so we could continue and have the seminar online today. So thank you so much for that. Today, I am going to be presenting really on two pieces of research. The first is a paper I have written with Brian Ehrlicher at the University of North Dakota and Liam Swiss at Acadia University. They are both full professors, and they're both experts in quantitative methods. My work has been primarily qualitative, and I think together we've been able to put together a solid paper that's going to hopefully, we hope it'll be published soon, and I think it's going to speak to a number of issues that both quantitative and qualitative scholars work on in this area. Brian is here today on Zoom, and he's generously agreed to answer any of the questions, particularly regarding the statistical analysis during the Q&A. Okay. Oh, sorry. And the second piece of research is the edited special issue, which just came out in International Negotiations. As Alex mentions, it's called Women and Peace Negotiations. Alex McAuliffe has also published a piece in that, which I'll mention during this talk, and I see that she is going to be presenting during the seminar series as well. Another person who's presenting at the Harvard seminar series is Elizabeth Corridor, and she also published a piece in the special issue, which I'll also mention later. Okay, so to start off, we'll start off I want to give a little bit of an overview of some of the literature on how women's inclusion matters in peace negotiations. So there's been quite a bit of literature, both qualitative and quantitative, both kind of large N and looking at individual case studies on why it matters when women are included in peace negotiations, and why it matters when women's rights are included in peace agreements. So for one thing, women's inclusion at negotiation results in longer lasting settlements, better implementation of settlements, and kind of perhaps not surprisingly, when women are included, it's more likely that you're going to get peace agreements that reflect women's issues, and you're going to see some women's rights in those agreements. When we get women's rights in the peace agreements, there's evidence that there's hastened women's electoral quota adoption, and as well as gains in women's empowerment in terms of legislative changes, as well as women's participation in formal and as well as informal politics. But I want to really flag here that all of these studies have been conducted on peace agreements or peace negotiations where peace agreements have been reached. And most peace negotiations do not conclude with peace agreements. So this data has focused on, has been drawn, these findings have been drawn from data which has looked at a subset of peace negotiations, leaving out unsuccessful peace negotiations. And as well as, of course, there's reasons why there's research that indicates why women's participation in peace agreements, peace negotiations matters. I think it's obvious that normatively, since peace negotiations are a critical juncture in a nation's history, it matters to have representation from 50% of the population at the table. So the questions we're going to ask here are, when are women included in Track 1 and Track 2 negotiations, and when are women's rights included in peace agreements? We have been able to ask this question now with a data set that includes failed negotiations. So we have a data set of all negotiations between 1989 and 2013. And I'll talk about that a little more on the next slide. But this is the first time we're able to analyze data with a set of peace negotiations that include all known negotiations. And so this is what we looked at. And the reason we were able to do this research was because of a data set that was published by Barish Ari in 2013 in the Journal of Conflict Resolution. And so this data set allowed us, so he had identified negotiating events between, sorry, it's actually longer than, it's 1975. Oh, no, or peace agreement. Okay, so his data set is goes further back than that. But so he identified negotiating events between those dates, which was then we were able to take those negotiating events and then look specifically to see if we could find any evidence of women participating in those negotiations. And what we did, so we looked for affirmative evidence. So we looked through, NGO reports, scholarly data, journalistic sources, and we looked for affirmative evidence of inclusion or affirmative evidence of exclusion. If there was no evidence of inclusion, we marked the event as negative. Although since women's participation in peace agreements, peace negotiations continues to be a rare event, if women are included, we expect that it's more likely than not there's going to be a note indicating that. We found that peace processes with women delegates, there is at least one woman delegate in almost 25% of peace negotiations during that time period. Obviously, that's still a pretty low number. We weren't able to code any further for whether those or not those women representing women, or if there's more than one woman necessarily. So this is I think a start to being able to produce more refined data about in this area. So we found 195 dyadic peace negotiations. The peace agreements are drawn from mostly the PAX data set. So Christine Bell, I know, is speaking at your series next week. So this is her data set. It's housed at the University of Edinburgh. And in that case, we narrowed her peace agreement data set is quite broad. Her criteria for coding is broad, so we excluded any unilateral statements and just included Civil War peace agreements that were signed between at least two of the warring parties. So in trying to determine why when we get women's participation in negotiation and women's rights in peace agreement, we started with kind of a bunch of we've constructed a number of hypotheses that come from the literature on women in conflict. And as it's probably fairly obvious to say that conflict is a deeply gendered institution in terms of roles individuals play, their experiences, risks to them. And during armed conflict, women often play roles that they would not play during peacetime. So they may join armed forces, for example. They may be combatants. They may become heads of household for the first time. They may work with other women to provide for their families. Marie Berry's work illustrates this. After the Rwandan genocide, for example, women got together to essentially just to meet the existential needs of themselves, their families, their communities, and in so doing, they found kind of associations. They started negotiating or liaising with non-governmental organizations, international organizations, and this kind of set the stage for them to then go into formal politics after war. So there's a lot of literature that, and then also women obviously take on, there's a lot of literature that looks at women becoming peace advocates and organizing protests and then sometimes participating in negotiations. So taking on a kind of a formal leadership and political role for the first time as a result of armed conflict and the result of negotiations. So we generated three hypotheses based on this kind of gendered social rupture that happens during war. So we looked at women combatants. So we figured that perhaps if there are women play more of a role in militant organizations, that they're more likely possibly to be represented in peace talks. This was actually inspired by some recent publications by Jacana Thomas, who I see is also presenting in your seminar series, who found that when women are more active in militant organizations, it seems that they have an indirect effect in influencing the peace, any kind of a peace agreement. Also, reports of sexual violence have been linked to women's provisions in peace agreements. It seems that when reports of sexual violence, when they're public, this seems to generate kind of more attention to women's rights and women's rights and their status in the post-conflict state, which seems to result in more likelihood of a gender-sensitive peace agreement. And there we drew on Cohen and Nordash's sexual violence data set. Also, we wanted to capture kind of non-violent mobilization. And so for this, we used Amanda Murdy's and Pexon's data set on non-violent women's protests. And this codes for women's protests that target the government. Which might include demonstrations, sit-ins, marches, strikes, and formal written petition drives. So we looked at that. Those are the gendered social rupture hypothesis that we generated. And we assumed that when there were higher levels of any of these things, it would also be more likely that we'd see participation of women in track 1, track 2 peace negotiations, as well as in and see women's rights reflected in peace agreements. We also assumed that international international political opportunity structure would be relevant here. So we thought the women, peace, and security agenda which functions as a global norm, should be relevant in women's inclusion in negotiations and women's rights and peace agreements. And we would assume, so this is just actually a binomial variable where we coded processes that occurred before or after 1325, Security Council Resolution 1325, which was passed in 2000. We also looked for the presence of international mediators. There's a number of case studies that indicate often that international mediators acted in some way as an ally to women who were trying to get traction within a negotiation process. And we used Ari's coding, Barsh Ari's coding for this as to whether or not there were international mediators involved in negotiations. And finally, we looked at the number of WINGOs, so Women's International NGOs. The assumption here is that when there are more international women's NGOs in a country, there's going to be more resources for promoting women's rights, and as well as there's going to be more, like the mediator, possibly more of an audience or more possibilities for allyship that local women can draw on in order to, again, gain traction in negotiations. So what did we find? So we found that there were kind of two sets of factors operating. So it looks like for women to get to the table, it's very much the international political opportunity structure that matters. International mediation was found to be statistically significant, as well as WINGOs. The more WINGOs in a country, the more likely it is you're going to get women at talks. Now, when it comes to women's rights in the peace agreement, we still see those two factors as relevant. And if you can see from the graphic here, the pillars are a little more transparent. And that's because there's not as strong correlation as what we see with this actually getting to the talks. But what we do see here as well is to get women's rights into the peace agreement, and to get more of them. And we're able to actually code for Christine Bell's PAX peace agreement data set, allow codes for gender dimension and up to 53 different dimensions that can be gendered in a peace agreement. So we can actually, there's like some nuance in that data as well to see, how many of these dimensions are addressed. But we see that local mobilization matters, and local mobilization matters in terms of women combatants. So the more prominent role women play in armed forces matters, and as well as local women's protests matter. So there's this mobilization, this participation that matters both within militant organizations as well as within nonviolent protest within civil society. And just to give a bit of a breakdown, a little more of the data, and I think if you want kind of more granular data or descriptions of this, my co-author Brian can address those in the Q&A. But we see that international mediation is statistically significant. The likelihood of there being women at track 1 talks without international mediation is about just over 2%. With international mediation, it goes up to almost 15%. Then we see with women's NGOs, so the more women's NGOs that are in a country, the more clauses or dimensions of gender dimensions you get in. Or sorry, no, this is inclusion. So the more NGOs, the more likely it is that they're going to be women at track 1 peace talks. And there's just a small mistake on this graphic that should say track 2 mediation. You see, I think this is pretty intuitive, and we kind of already know this, that it's more likely women are going to be included in track 2 negotiations, the more informal negotiations or the broader negotiations than track 1. But we see again, statistically significant relationship with international mediation and women being in track 2 talks. Again, strong correlation between women's NGOs and women's participation in track 2. And then when we look at the agreements, we see that both nonviolent protest and women combatants do matter for women statistically. They're statistically significant for having provisions related to women's rights in the agreements, and then a very strong relation, again, with women's NGOs. And here I want to turn to some of the articles that were written in the special issue that was just published in August. So I want to talk about 3 case studies. So one is Burundi, one is Syria, and one is Colombia, that I think really align with what we see in the quantitative data. So we see in Colombia, so in the case of Colombia, women were initially shut out of the negotiations. In 2013, local women advocates lobbied to access the negotiations. They held a 3-day summit, actually, that was, and UN women played a large role in that summit. In 2014, the Gender Subcommission was created, which included women from the FARC as well as women from the government, to have their own space in the negotiations. As a result of this, they produced 100 measures pertaining to women's rights, or pertaining to a gendered perspective, using gendered language. It's the first peace agreement in the world to mention LGBTI rights. These negotiations had a large dimension, a large international dimension. They had international mediators. And they were very much in the world's public eye. So all of the things we'd probably expect from our data to mean that you're going to have that you're going to get a gender inclusive negotiations and agreements. The Burundi case, and this is Burundi. I've done a lot of research on Burundi, and this is from my article with Mark Valade that's in the special issue. So in this case, women lobbied to be part of the negotiations for 2 years. The male decision makers, who picture of them on the bottom slide, were not in favor of women participating. The picture on the top is a picture with Nelson Mandela, who was the international mediator during the negotiations. The women lobbied him directly, as well as with UNIFEM, which is now UN Women, and other organizations helped them make trips to Tanzania to lobby the negotiating teams, as well as to meet with Mandela. And as a result of Mandela's intervention, as well as the intervention of other women's organizations, international women's organizations, as well as local women's organizations, they were able to all women's peace forum was created, where they were able to then insert gendered provisions into the agreement. Then we have a case, the Syrian peace talks, which this is based on an article written by Marie-Joëlle Zahar. And we have quite a different result here. So here we have, in this case, the UN Special Envoy created a women's advisory board. So 15 women, Syrian women, were appointed by this board. They were supposed to represent a diversity of Syrian women, so from different regions, different professional backgrounds. But there was a number of constraints that they're put on these women. So they were told that they could only have a unified position. They had to have a unified position. They couldn't address certain issues of the conflict. They're not supposed to be political. And they'd speak also with a single voice. So as a result, and what I've posted here is actually an article by Mona Ganem, who is a member she is a member of the advisory board. And so people within the advisory board and outside the advisory board have criticized this in the constraints that were based on the constraints that were put upon these women. As well, local activists actually came out publicly and said things like, these women do not represent us. The men involved in negotiations said that these women had no legitimacy because they'd been appointed by the UN. So here we have a case where nominally you have women involved in this process, but there isn't a link to local mobilization, which seems to be in large part why they aren't considered to be legitimate. So again, I think this confirms kind of what we found in the quantitative data, that in order to actually to have impact in the negotiations, there needs to be a strong link between local women and women who are actually at the talks. So what are the policy implications? And I've decided to end with this picture. So this is a picture of negotiations between Russians and Ukrainians. This is actually pretty typical for how negotiations look in terms of gender composition. So legitimacy and authority does matter. And also the strong international impact. So women's NGOs, as well as international mediators, shows that there's a large space for international actors to influence, to be able to assist women participating in negotiations. So I think there's a lot of policy work that can be done, and looking at how exactly that can be most effective. But also that women's participation does continue to be rare. And I think there's a lot of work that, like most of the research that's been done, particularly in the case studies, looks at positive cases, looks at cases where women have beaten the odds, they've managed to get to negotiations. In some cases, they managed to get women's rights in the agreement, but we don't know too much about what's going on in the negative cases. Say in the Russian-Ukrainian case, I think it would be interesting to know, is there pressure on either side to include women? What is going on? We don't know. So we don't know in these failed cases, and these are the majority of cases. So I think I think finding out would also help us know where are those junctures that women are being excluded from. And thinking about future research. So specifically to the work that I've presented here, we would like to refine the data set. Obviously, not to just look at whether or not there's women included, but how are they being included? Are they mediators? Are they negotiators? Are they members of civil society? Are they women who advocate for women? Also, I think our research calls for more mixed methods work. And we hope that this data set will provide the ability to do more of it. As I've mentioned, more negative cases need to be looked at. And as well, it's worth noting that only 40% of agreements make it beyond 5 years. And so we need to also be looking at what happens when negotiations fail. And obviously what can be done to ensure or promote longevity of negotiations. And finally, I want to close with something that Alex McAuliffe in her article asked us to think about. And she uses the term embodied participation. And most of the research I've talked about today is indeed that, is focused on the embodied participation of women. But more broadly, she asks us to look at gender as an analytic category. So the issues that are discussed in negotiations, the hierarchies of violence and what is considered relevant, this is also determined by gender. And obviously a broader approach to explore negotiations is also needed. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to continuing the discussion with you.